I'm Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. So last week, we talked about continuing education in genealogy and how to keep your skills sharp and expand your skills into new areas. Naturally, one way to do this is through podcasts. But I kind of skimmed over that last week because I wanted to give other genealogy podcasts a fair overview, and I just didn't have time last week. It also gives me the opportunity to talk about something that I've been needing to bring up but haven't really had a good opportunity to weave into the conversation. An episode about other genealogy podcasts is the perfect time for me to talk about the future of this podcast. I've been doing this podcast now every week for a year, and I feel like I've accomplished my mission of helping people transition from beginning genealogists to maybe experienced beginners, if not intermediate. I don't want to end up being one of those podcasts that just rinses and repeats ideas from previous episodes to keep going, and monetizing the podcast was never really part of my plan, so rather than come up with increasingly strained ideas every week, I'll be changing the format of the show. The final weekly episode of our usual format will be December 30th, episode 52. I'll talk more in that episode about where I want to take things in the future, but in this episode, I wanted to point you in a number of directions you can go in the podcast space and keep your development on the right path and scratch the itch for regular genealogy content. So let me give you a peek into my podcast playlist and give you some ideas of other great places to listen. In no particular order other than the order that I see them as I scroll through my podcast app, I'll start with Lisa Louise Cook's podcast, The Genealogy Gems. While not explicitly a genealogy education show, you can think of it as a monthly long conversation with your best genealogy bud who happens to be one of the bigger names in the field. She usually talks about some new tool she's been messing with, how it works, and how she's incorporated it into her workflow. She'll often bring guests to talk about specific strategies. One of her more recent episodes had author Shelley Bishop on to talk about finding elusive maiden names. So if you're only in the mood for tips and training, you can dig through her extensive back catalog and just listen to those. She's been doing the show since 2007, so there's plenty to choose from. Her free podcast does often include pitches for her paid content, so you've got to sift through the occasional ad. But it's never really bothered me, and besides, most podcast apps have that skip ahead 30 seconds button for a reason. Since we've already talked about Lisa, might as well also talk about another podcast that she's part of. The Family Tree Magazine podcast is really kind of two podcasts in one feed. They release an episode every 2 weeks, but it alternates between a, say, normal episode and a website highlight episode. Their normal episodes cover topics that range widely within the genealogy field. Some examples from recent episodes are heritage trips, Ancestry Pro tools, and AI in genealogy. The website highlight episodes are a relatively recent addition to their schedule, but they're often shorter episodes that look closely at a particular online resource. Their most recent one, as of this recording, was about the American Battle Monuments Commission. Another good one they've done in the past few months was an in-depth look at using a number of different Google tools within your genealogy workflow. Their back catalog runs all the way back to 2008, so again, there's plenty of content there if you're hungry for more. I'm a regular reader of the Family Tree magazine, and I'm a regular listener to the podcast as well. This is definitely one that I listen to the same week that it releases. One that I listen to as soon as it hits my podcast inbox is Hittin' the Bricks with Kathleen, hosted by Kathleen Brandt. The publication schedule is a little irregular, but she generally puts out an episode once a month. I'm a big fan of her format, and it's different from a lot of podcasts out there, and it's not just Kathleen talking about how to be a good genealogist. She's a working professional genealogist, and she brings people onto her show where she walks them methodically through solving a brick wall that they'd contacted her about. I've really enjoyed listening to how she works through complex problems because while the specific cases that she's discussing may not be all that helpful for things that I'm working on, understanding the thought process can be really helpful in building a more disciplined and thorough approach myself. Her show has only been publishing episodes since January of 23, so the back catalog isn't that deep, but each episode will give you a lot to think about. It's not really a beginner-focused podcast, but if you've listened through this podcast, you're more than ready to start listening to Kathleen. Another show that I eagerly await, it's another weekly show, is the Research Like a Pro genealogy podcast with Diana Elder and Nicole Dyer. They're a mother-daughter team that does slightly longer form episodes at usually about 30 minutes a week. Each episode usually does some brief news and updates in the beginning, a pitch for their classes and work groups, and then they usually dive into a case study. They've been doing a lot of topical episodes lately about things like AI, but I'd say the heart of the show is the case studies. The show covers a broad range of topics within the genealogy field, but they lean heavily on the DNA side of things. So if that's an area of interest for you, I'd encourage you to head over and give them a listen. I sometimes feel like they're holding back a bit. I've often wondered if that's because they offer paid content as well. But to be fair, while their episodes are a fair bit longer than mine, 30 minutes is still not really a lot of time to get into the weeds on topics like DNA that have a lot of weeds to get into. But you can certainly learn enough from them in the free podcast to better steer your learning on your own. Another kind of genealogy potpourri show is the Genealogy guys. It's got a bit of everything: news, tips, how-tos, interviews with big names in the business, and the occasional deep dive into a specific topic. There are a number of podcasts that have been around for a while, but the guys have been around for perhaps the longest of anyone. Coming up this September, it will be 20 years of pretty much one episode every month. That kind of consistency really takes commitment, and the guys are absolutely committed. I'll say that I don't listen to every episode of this one, but I tune in several times a year because they do hit on some news that you won't find too many other places. There are several other general topic genealogy shows out there, but the ones that I've listed are the ones that most regularly make it into my listening rotation. Part of me really wants to share all the great podcasts that I listen to, but since none of the rest are genealogy related, I'll spare you. There is one other unique podcast that I listen to that is genealogy adjacent, I would say. The show is called DNA ID, and it's really more of a true crime show than a genealogy one. But every crime the host covers is ultimately solved through investigative genetic genealogy. If you're unfamiliar, it's an investigative methodology that merges forensic DNA analysis with traditional genealogy. If that sounds exciting to you, that's because it is. DNA ID is very thoroughly researched, with each episode taking about an hour, and several episodes take much longer, so it's not really a commute listen. But if you're mowing the lawn or you're on a flight, it's great. It's definitely not for those with weak stomachs, but if you've got the right constitution, it's fascinating. This is also where I make an exciting transition to talk about next week's episode. I'm going to have some of the founders of Moxie Forensic Investigations joining us to talk about investigative genetic genealogy. I'm real pumped to be able to share this conversation with you, and I think it'll get you excited about the future of genealogy as a crime-fighting tool. But either way, as I wind down the weekly publishing of this podcast, I hope that I've been able to give you some other good ones to put into your listening queue as you continue to sharpen your skills and break down those brick walls. If you think I missed a great genealogy podcast, share it with me on Twitter, @thewgtpod, or over on Facebook. I'm always up for a new one to listen to. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.